When someone withdraws right after hurting you, it's natural to read that distance as a kind of verdict. It can feel like quiet proof that what you shared with them simply wasn't valuable enough to keep them close, wasn't enough to make them stay present. That feeling can be one of the most painful parts of loving someone who struggles with emotional closeness. The silence begins to feel like a message, and the mind starts filling in the empty spaces with the most painful explanations. Maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe what we had didn't matter. Maybe I cared more than they did. When someone pulls away, especially someone with avoidant patterns, the instinctive reaction is often to measure their distance as a reflection of our worth. We look at their absence and interpret it as rejection. We look at their quietness and assume it means indifference. We look at their need for space and believe it means we were not important enough to be chosen. But sometimes another person's withdrawal is not a statement about your value. Sometimes it is a reflection of their own relationship with vulnerability, emotional intimacy, and fear. For some people, closeness brings comfort. For others, closeness can also bring fear. The deeper the connection becomes, the more exposed they may feel. Being truly known can feel both beautiful and threatening. A person who has learned to protect themselves emotionally may retreat not because the relationship meant nothing, but because it meant something powerful enough to activate their defenses. This creates one of the most confusing experiences in relationships. Someone can care about you and still struggle to remain emotionally available. That does not erase the hurt caused by their distance. Feeling abandoned or ignored is painful. Your need for reassurance, communication, and emotional presence is valid. A relationship cannot survive on hidden feelings alone. Love also requires actions, consistency, and the willingness to meet each other halfway. But understanding this difference can change the way you see yourself. Their inability to stay present does not automatically mean you are forgettable. Their difficulty expressing emotions does not mean you are not meaningful. Their retreat does not erase the moments of connection you shared. Sometimes people leave because something was meaningless, but sometimes people create distance because something feels too emotionally overwhelming, too unfamiliar, or too vulnerable. Think about a person who has spent years building emotional walls. Those walls were not built because they never wanted connection. Often they were built because connection once felt unsafe. When someone comes along and creates genuine closeness, those walls can become confused. The person may desire the very thing they fear. They may miss you while staying silent. They may think about you while avoiding contact. They may care while struggling to communicate that care in a healthy way. However, the most important part of healing is recognizing that understanding someone's behavior does not mean excusing everything they do. You can have compassion for someone's fears while still honoring your own needs. You can understand why someone struggles with intimacy while still acknowledging that you deserve someone who is willing to show up for you. The painful question often becomes, why wasn't I enough to make them stay? But perhaps the deeper question is, why did I make someone's inability to stay a measurement of my worth? Because love is not a test where the person who loves harder wins. Sometimes you can offer patience, kindness, understanding, and genuine care, and someone may still not have the emotional capacity to receive it. That does not make your love meaningless. The moments you shared were real because you experienced them. The kindness you gave mattered because it came from a genuine place. Your ability to love deeply is not something to be ashamed of, or something that becomes less valuable because someone else struggled to hold it. Sometimes people are not walking away because you were not worth staying for. Sometimes they are walking away because staying requires them to confront parts of themselves they are not ready to face. And that realization can be painful, but it can also be freeing. Because your worth was never supposed to depend on whether someone else had the ability to recognize it. The right connection will not require you to constantly prove that you deserve attention, care, or emotional presence. Healthy love is not built on chasing someone who keeps disappearing. It is built when two people are willing to move toward each other, even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Your value does not decrease because someone struggled to stay close. A person can fail to appreciate something precious, but that does not make it any less precious. It only reveals the limits of their ability to recognize and protect what was in front of them. That interpretation makes total emotional sense, but it usually misses the deeper psychological process happening underneath, especially if you're dealing with someone who leans avoidant in how they attach to people. For someone avoidant, distance is almost never a straightforward sign of disinterest or emotional detachment the way most people assume. It isn't a clean break, and it isn't an absence of feeling. It's something far more tangled and internally conflicted than that. It's a form of self-protection that kicks in when their emotional system gets overloaded, too exposed, or simply too much for them to handle in that particular moment. Here's something important to understand. The instant they realize they've hurt you, something inside them destabilizes. It's not just ordinary guilt, it's exposure. It's the sudden, jarring awareness that they've caused real emotional harm, and now there's an unspoken expectation that they show up, take responsibility, repair the damage, and stay emotionally engaged. In that moment, vulnerability stops being optional. For someone whose entire sense of safety is built around emotional control, independence, and psychological distance, that realization can feel like the ground shifting under them. So instead of moving toward you to fix the rupture, they often move away instead, trying to regain some kind of internal equilibrium. From the outside, that retreat looks like indifference, like they don't value what broke enough to bother repairing it. But internally, what's actually happening is usually far more layered than that surface reading suggests. Internally, they're trying to manage emotional overload. They're attempting to quiet a wave of discomfort they don't fully know how to sit with or process. Their mind often shifts into protective mode, convincing them that space will lower the intensity, that distance will prevent additional harm. It becomes an unconscious form of emotional regulation. Their internal logic starts sounding like, if I stay close, I might make this worse, or if I try to fix this right now, I'll only deepen the damage, or I don't know how to handle this the right way, so I should step back first. Distance becomes their go-to solution, not because it genuinely resolves anything, but because it temporarily eases the internal pressure they're feeling. And this is exactly where the core misunderstanding takes root. Because while they experience that distance as a way of regaining control and reducing internal chaos, you experience that exact same distance as abandonment. You're left holding the emotional weight of everything that happened, searching for acknowledgement, for clarity, for repair, or even just some basic presence confirming that your experience actually matters. Instead, you're met with silence or withdrawal. And that silence doesn't feel neutral at all. It feels like an extension of the original wound, almost like a second layer of pain stacked directly on top of the first. What matters here is recognizing that the avoidant response isn't really designed to heal the relationship. It's designed to regulate the self. And those two goals are not the same thing at all. Genuine healing requires engagement, emotional tolerance, discomfort, accountability, and the willingness to remain present even when things feel tense or heavy. It requires sitting inside the emotional consequences long enough to actually understand them, then taking consistent steps to rebuild trust. But self-regulation, especially within an avoidant pattern, tends to prioritize immediate relief over any kind of long-term resolution. So the person steps back, often without realizing that in doing so, they're actually prolonging the very pain they're trying to escape. There's also a deeper layer to all of this. For a lot of avoidant people, closeness was never experienced as purely safe. It's also experienced as risk. The risk of losing autonomy, of becoming emotionally overwhelmed, of being seen in ways that feel too exposing. So the moment conflict happens and they've genuinely hurt you, closeness suddenly carries even more weight than usual. It's no longer just intimacy, it becomes accountability, it becomes emotional confrontation. And if they haven't developed the internal capacity to stay grounded through that kind of exposure, withdrawal becomes their default fallback. The problem is, this form of protection is misapplied, because what they're actually protecting themselves from isn't real danger, it's emotional discomfort and internal conflict. In doing so, they unintentionally create the exact outcome they were trying to avoid: disconnection. There's a painful irony in this. The very behavior meant to prevent loss ends up contributing to it. The real tragedy isn't that they don't care, it's that their particular coping style prevents them from expressing that care in a way that could actually maintain or repair the relationship. This leaves you in a genuinely confusing spot. You might be dealing with someone who feels things deeply on the inside, but whose outward behavior communicates the exact opposite. Someone who withdraws at precisely the moment when closeness, clarity, and repair matter the most. This is exactly why it's important not to confuse their distance with some objective truth about your worth, or about how much the relationship actually meant. Distance in this context isn't a direct statement about your importance. It's more a reflection of how that particular person handles emotional stress and responsibility. That said, understanding this doesn't mean you're supposed to carry the fallout indefinitely. Intent doesn't erase impact. Even if their withdrawal is rooted in fear, overwhelm, or confusion, the outcome for you is still emotional absence, a lack of acknowledgement, and unresolved pain. So the real question isn't just why they're distancing themselves, it's what you choose to do in response. Do you treat that distance as something you're supposed to chase, fix, or wait out indefinitely? Or do you recognize it as a genuine limitation in their current ability to engage in repair and emotional responsibility? Because distance that avoids accountability isn't real protection, it's delay. And delay, repeated enough times, eventually turns into actual emotional loss. If you look closer at this pattern, you'll often find something quieter, but far more powerful underneath it. Guilt. Not the healthy kind of guilt that leads to repair and reconnection, but an unresolved, internalized version that becomes overwhelming instead of motivating. Instead of thinking, I need to fix this, it warps into I am the problem, or I'm someone who causes harm. And that identity becomes genuinely difficult to face, especially for someone who prefers to see themselves as controlled, self-contained, and someone who doesn't disrupt others emotionally. So instead of moving toward repair, they move away from the emotional meaning of what they've done. They start constructing internal narratives that justify the distance. Thoughts like, if I go back, I'll only make things worse. Or, if I try to explain myself, I'll just be misunderstood. Or, if I stay involved, I'll lose control of the situation all over again. These thoughts aren't always fully conscious or deliberate, but they do serve a purpose, reducing emotional pressure. So distance starts to feel like the responsible choice, even though it's actually avoidance wearing a disguise. Real responsibility doesn't remove you from the impact you've caused. It requires you to stay present within it, acknowledge it clearly, and actively participate in repairing it. And that's exactly the emotional territory avoidant patterns struggle with most. The complexity deepens further, because the guilt doesn't just vanish once they withdraw. It often lingers quietly in the background, surfacing in quiet moments, in memories, in the persistent awareness that something remains unresolved. But instead of pulling them back toward repair, it often reinforces the belief that returning would be too difficult, or that they simply aren't capable of handling the emotional intensity the situation requires. So the avoidance becomes self-perpetuating. The more they feel like they've failed, the less likely they are to try again. From where you're standing, this can be deeply confusing because you probably associate guilt with reconnection, accountability, and action. In healthier relational dynamics, guilt typically leads to an apology, a real conversation, meaningful change, repair. So when none of that shows up, it's natural to assume the guilt simply isn't there. But in a lot of avoidant dynamics, the feeling is genuinely present internally. It just never translates into behavior that supports actual repair. And relationships aren't sustained by internal emotion alone. They're sustained by consistent, observable action, real communication, and a willingness to stay present through discomfort. This is exactly why unresolved guilt can sometimes be more damaging than no guilt at all, because it creates internal tension without any external repair, leaving everything suspended in a kind of emotional limbo. There's a sense that something real exists underneath the surface, but no actual action confirming it. And that ambiguity can keep you emotionally tethered to something that isn't actually moving forward. It keeps you waiting for a response that never truly arrives. Over time, that waiting becomes its own form of emotional weight. You start questioning not just their behavior, but your own read on the entire situation. You wonder if you're asking for too much, if you're misinterpreting things, if maybe their silence means something different than it feels like, but it doesn't. Silence in this context isn't neutral space. It's an active absence of repair, and regardless of whatever internal conflict is driving it, the outcome for you stays the same. You're left without closure, and once you start understanding how guilt turns inward and distance becomes a form of retreat, another layer emerges, one that's often the most confusing from the outside, because even inside that distance, even inside that silence, the connection doesn't just vanish for them, it changes shape instead. This is where you run into a genuinely difficult truth. They can miss you and still not come back. For most people, missing someone naturally leads to action. It creates a pull toward reconnecting, a desire to close the gap, to say or do something that restores what was lost. But for someone who avoids emotional discomfort, that internal feeling doesn't operate the same way. It stays contained inside them, almost disconnected from action entirely. They feel the absence, but they don't act on it. And this isn't because the feeling is weak. Often, it's actually the opposite. The feeling can be strong enough to keep resurfacing, to return repeatedly, to linger in quiet moments. They think about what you shared together. They replay old conversations. They recognize what genuinely mattered. There's a real awareness of the loss. But that awareness doesn't necessarily lead to movement, because the same internal system that made them retreat in the first place is still fully active. The same fear of emotional exposure, the same discomfort around vulnerability, the same uncertainty about how to even begin repairing what was damaged, all of it stays intact. So instead of letting that longing pull them back toward you, they just hold it internally. They sit with it rather than acting on it. But even that recognition doesn't always bring them back, because returning would mean stepping out of that safely controlled internal space and back into something real. It would mean confronting the unresolved parts of the connection, actually dealing with the hurt, and facing the uncertainty of how you might respond. And for someone already wired to avoid emotional pressure, that step feels like too much, so they stay where it feels safer, in thought, not in action. And this is exactly where the gap becomes most painful for you, because on your end, love, care, and connection get expressed through presence, effort, and the willingness to show up even when it's hard. So when someone goes silent, doesn't reach out, doesn't attempt repair, it feels like an unmistakable message that you simply didn't matter enough. But the reality is more complicated and often far more frustrating than that. It's not that you didn't matter. It's that what you represented required more emotional capacity than they currently have access to. So instead of stepping into that space, they retreat into a version of the connection that demands nothing from them. This creates a real imbalance between you two. You're dealing with reality, what actually happened, what was said, what genuinely needs repairing. They're dealing with an internal, edited version, what they felt, what they remember, what they can revisit without discomfort. And those two experiences never actually meet. They exist side by side without connecting. This is why it can feel like you're holding something real while they're holding something distant and abstract. You're responding to the relationship as it was actually lived. They're responding to it as it's now remembered. And memory, unlike real life, doesn't demand responsibility. It doesn't require an apology. It doesn't ask for explanation. It doesn't push for change. It simply allows feeling to exist without any action attached to it. But that kind of connection, if you can even call it that, is fundamentally incomplete, because real connection isn't built on feeling alone. It requires participation. It requires effort. It requires someone actually willing to move toward you, not just think about you. And when that movement is missing, the connection starts fading, maybe not in their mind, but in actual, lived reality. So you're left in a situation that feels genuinely contradictory. Someone might still think about you, might still feel something real for you, might still recognize your value, and yet remain completely absent from your actual life. And the natural hope is that those feelings will eventually convert into action. That one day, what they feel internally will grow strong enough to override the fear. But that shift doesn't happen automatically, because feeling something deeply is not the same thing as being ready to act on it. And until those two things align, nothing genuinely changes. So here's the clarity worth holding on to. You cannot build a relationship on someone's internal, private experience of you. You cannot rely on thoughts, memories, or unspoken emotions, no matter how real they feel to that person, if they never translate into steady, visible action. Without that translation, they don't create stability, they create uncertainty. And over time, uncertainty erodes trust, safety, and emotional balance. So while they may genuinely miss you in silence, while they may quietly carry pieces of you with them, that alone isn't enough to sustain a connection that actually requires presence, because what isn't expressed can't be fully shared, and what can't be shared can't be maintained. And when you put all of this together, the distance, the guilt that turns inward, the silence that still somehow contains real emotion, you arrive at the central tension inside this kind of avoidant pattern. It's not simply that they leave, it's that they're internally divided the entire time they're leaving. Because underneath it all, there are always two forces operating simultaneously. One is the genuine desire for closeness, for connection, for emotional safety with another person. The other is an equally powerful fear of everything that closeness demands once it becomes real: vulnerability, responsibility, exposure, and the risk of being overwhelmed by emotions they don't feel ready to handle. And these two forces don't cancel each other out. They coexist constantly, uneasily, side by side. So when they hurt you and then pull away, what you're actually witnessing isn't a simple, clean decision. It's an unresolved internal conflict, a divided state where one part of them knows they care, while another part genuinely believes that staying close will only cause more harm for both of you. And instead of actually working through that conflict toward resolution, they step away from it entirely. They put distance between themselves and the tension as a way of managing it. They try to maintain space, believing distance will somehow make things more manageable. But containing something isn't the same as resolving it. Containment doesn't solve the underlying problem, it just holds it in place temporarily. What typically follows is a repeating internal cycle that continues even when they're physically nowhere near the situation. The feelings don't just end or disappear, the pull toward you doesn't fully fade. It resurfaces in quiet moments, in emotional lulls, in the small gaps where distraction is no longer strong enough to drown it out. In those moments, they feel the pull again, toward reconnection, toward you, toward what once existed between you. But almost simultaneously, another force rises up inside them, resistance. It's the awareness of all the emotional weight that would come rushing back if they returned. It's the memory of everything that would need to be faced, explained or repaired if they stepped closer again. So they end up caught between two emotional experiences that both feel completely real, but don't align with each other. One part of them moves toward connection, while another part pulls away from it at the exact same time. This is why they remain suspended, as if paused between two directions, not fully present but not fully gone either. They're stuck in a kind of middle ground that never fully resolves, and this is precisely where most misunderstandings begin. From your perspective, distance looks like a clear conclusion. Absence equals decision. It feels like if someone truly cared, they'd move closer. If someone genuinely valued the connection, they'd try to repair it. If someone truly wanted you in their life, there would be consistent behavior proving it. This way of interpreting things makes total sense, because most people link emotion and action directly and visibly. But what's actually happening here isn't that simple. You're dealing with a situation where emotional desire doesn't smoothly convert into behavior. The intention might genuinely exist, but it gets interrupted before it ever becomes action. The internal feelings are real, but they don't always make it out into the world in a stable, consistent way. There's a real divide between what's experienced internally and what actually gets expressed externally, and that gap creates confusion for whoever's waiting for consistency, because what you're observing doesn't match what you assume is happening underneath. So what you're actually facing isn't someone completely absent from the connection. It's not a clean or simple disappearance. Instead, it's someone who's emotionally present in flashes but unstable in their outward behavior. There are moments where the feeling is clearly there, where awareness is active, where emotional recognition is obvious, but those moments never transform into consistent action. They never become reliable communication or steady effort sustained over time. This kind of pattern makes letting go incredibly difficult because the situation isn't actually empty. If there were genuinely nothing there, the mind would eventually accept that and close the emotional loop. Over time, it would become clear there's no direction left to pursue. But when emotion exists without action and awareness exists without any follow-through, it creates a gap that the mind keeps trying to fill in and interpret. That gap becomes space for assumptions. It becomes space for hope. It becomes space for waiting, for thinking that maybe something will still shift later on. Maybe the timing will change. Maybe distance will bring clarity. Maybe they'll eventually realize what was lost and come back differently. What often goes unnoticed is that this kind of internal conflict doesn't resolve itself simply because time passes. Time alone doesn't merge fear and desire into clarity. Distance alone doesn't automatically make someone emotionally ready. Silence alone doesn't produce understanding or emotional stability. In a lot of avoidant patterns, time can actually reinforce the avoidance rather than dissolve it. The longer the distance continues, the more the mind adapts to it. The internal narrative gradually reorganizes itself around the idea that distance feels safer. The emotional system starts treating staying away as the lower risk option. Coming back doesn't get easier with time. In many cases, it actually becomes more emotionally loaded because it gets tied to pressure, vulnerability, and exposure. So the internal conflict doesn't disappear, but it becomes less visible from the outside. It quiets down on the surface without ever actually resolving underneath. Because of all this, it's worth adjusting how you understand the whole situation. It's easy to take someone's internal struggle and turn it into meaning about future potential. It's easy to assume that if someone feels conflicted, change must be close. It's easy to believe that emotional tension automatically leads to movement. But struggle alone doesn't guarantee change. Awareness alone doesn't guarantee action. Feeling something intensely doesn't automatically mean a person has the actual capacity to act on it in any stable or consistent way. What actually matters is whether those internal experiences ever get translated into visible behavior over time. Behavior that builds trust, creates real emotional safety, and repairs harm instead of repeating the same withdrawal pattern. Without that translation into action, the connection simply cannot become stable or reliable. So the real question was never whether they feel conflicted or divided internally. That part might already be obvious. The real question is what that internal conflict actually produces in reality. Does it lead toward genuine repair and reconnection, or does it keep circling back to distance over and over? In a lot of avoidant patterns, that conflict never moves forward into resolution. Instead, it cycles right back into withdrawal, because withdrawal is exactly what reduces the emotional pressure. The moment they step back, the intensity inside their internal system finally starts to ease.